Hello everyone, this is Charlie, Jack's better half. If you like the episode, please do consider giving us a like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and a follow and a 5-star if you're on Spotify. It really does help us out. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy. You can actually sustain very high levels of debt without it becoming a problem. The problem actually comes when either growth stops, when the population starts to decline, or when interest rates rise. And all three of those things are now a problem.
Hello to our listeners and our viewers. Today we're talking about how much should we worry about national debt. But before we get on to that, this is a prime time, and it fits into our characters perfectly, to gloat about how right we were about the tariffs. I mean, shall we take a few minutes just to pat ourselves on the back?
Absolutely. I can't think of any better use of our time than to just sit in a moment of recognition of our brilliance and just accept that, yeah, these tariffs have been an absolute catastrophe. And I do genuinely believe we cannot reward good behavior. So as much as it is bad that these tariffs are going to, really have bad consequences, at the same time, you've got to take a little bit from it. If everything went really well, then Trump would be able to go for the next 3 years. Oh my God, I'm the best president of all time. Biden was all for. If it goes badly, at least we do get that moment of recompense. Everything's going to... We were right after all.
But it's mental. Our whole thing was talking about 25% tariffs or whatever it was on Canada and China. And now they've been increased to what, 125? I mean,
You said at one point you wanted our podcast to be timeless. And at the moment, the last one is incredibly outdated. We were talking like you said, 25, 10... Well, now we've got 125% on tariffs, which I didn't realize makes up 16% of the US's imports. So... it could be pretty bad.
Definitely expecting some high inflation, I would imagine. We've said that we'll talk in a later podcast about how the tariff equation was calculated, because that's really, shall we call it interesting, peculiar?
Basic,
I don't know. What's the
basic,
right word?
I think might be the word. And so, yeah, we'll do a very short episode, on how that was calculated.
Right. So how does that, which we were so incredibly right about, link to today's topic, Charlie? Because that's sort of why we're going into it.
Yeah, I did want to second that, Jack. We were incredibly right about the tariffs. I'm really glad you brought that up. So what we're talking about today is national debt a bad thing? And this is so interesting because it basically underpins the whole, well, up until about the last 10 years, the traditional left versus right wing approach. And this idea that can you spend more money without having to raise taxes and therefore rely on debt? Is that a problem? And there's a lot of divide on this amongst the political spectrum, even though economists are relatively united on this nowadays. But it ties into the tariff thing so incredibly nicely because, like we said last week, tariffs, trade deficits are basically a response to if you're spending more than you're earning as an economy. So if you're running high levels of debt, you're naturally going to be running trade deficits. And so these sort of things go sort of hand in hand, sort of two sides of the same coin in some ways. And so we're sort of going to expand on this and see if debt's bad and under what circumstances it is and under what circumstances it isn't. And I've read a poll recently, I think it was from The Economist or the FT recently, Jack, that said it was about 60% of people in the UK believe that we can increase government spending without having to increase tax. And you can look at this a few different ways. You can look at it from, the quite optimistic way and you say, okay, people are really understanding the nuances of debt and how it works in the economy. You can look at it from a more cynical way and sort of say that political literacy might not be thriving. So it'll be interesting, but it's something that politicians have got to grapple with the new reality of, that no matter what the reality is, the public believes that debt is not a constraint, and that's interesting in itself.
Yeah, well, then at that point, you can see why people are angry with austerity, because they're just wondering, why can't we just chuck a few billion into the NHS? I mean, there's no problem with it. And start all this Rachel Reeves putting in fiscal controls and limits. It seems a bit pointless. It's like, why aren't you spending more?
Yeah, and that sort of makes sense. As why? Also, there was sort of reading a report from the International Monetary Fund, which was saying that across the left and right, there has been more of an inclination for both parties to spend more, even though those on the conservative right wing would always normally be the ones of fiscal responsibility. The Republicans in the US used to be fiscal hawks, you'd call them, and now the orange across the pond is now running some of the biggest deficits the US has ever seen. And so, it's in peacetime or in non-crisis. So it is unbelievable how the compass has essentially shifted and how perceptions have just shifted across both the left and right. Yeah.
So at this point, it's probably a good idea to talk about some stats, right, Charlie? So have you got any in front of you about how big is national debt at the moment?
I wouldn't come to the podcast without having locked and loaded a couple of stats. So I think the real big one I've taken this from the International Monetary Fund. So global debt is expected to reach over 100 trillion US dollars. Very, very soon, and that's about 93% of global GDP, and is forecast to reach over 100% of GDP, global GDP, by about 2030. And that's in recognition that these forecasts are always massively over-optimistic, really leaning into humans' optimism bias. And they basically attribute this a lot to rising costs of aging populations, increased healthcare spending, increased pension spending, which is obviously what we explained in a previous episode, so go check it out. I also just wanted to list a couple of countries here to really give an impression of just how much debt these countries are operating under. So the OECD average is about 77%. The UK is about 99% of GDP. The US is about $30 trillion, which is about 120% of GDP. You then have Japan at the highest at 245% of GDP. And
So
you, myself, and I, Jack, actually have, I think by my calculation, we have about a debt of about 290% of our own personal GDP, which, as a fundamental fact, is about 3.7 times the OECD average. So
that's a nice one. Thank you for that stat,
No
Charlie.
worries.
Does that include my massive crippling gambling debts, or is that?
No, it doesn't actually, Jack. That would increase the
Yeah, nothing like the Splitwise isn't on there or anything like that.
No, your house bills, none of that.
One there, obviously, we know of this from any economist knows about this, but the whole Japan having debt of 250% of GDP, I imagine that gives a lot of evidence to those people saying, well, debt doesn't matter because look how high theirs is. My first overarching point here is going to be that we care in history. I would say that we've cared too much about debt in bad times and too little about it in good times. That tends to be the trend. And why we should care about debt at all, I think the first main thing is that there is a point where debt becomes unsustainable, that it can spiral. And the reason for that is because the higher the debt is, the higher the interest rate, or for you technical people out there, the higher the yield needs to be, which means that past a certain point, the interest rate payments are going to keep increasing the debt and it'll just keep going up and up and up. So that means that there's sort of a limit, which means every time you're increasing the debt, you're meaning that the next generation are going to have to either bring it down or they're not going to have the headroom for any sort of financial crisis or any crisis like COVID. That, these things bump up our national debt by, tens of percent. And they won't have the headroom for that.
Yeah, and this leads to a really interesting little bit of theory, I guess, which says that, a debt is sustainable by a government if the interest rate is less than the productivity growth rate of the economy or the population growth rate, essentially, because that means that later generations can afford to pay back the debt and essentially run this sort of infinite proxy scheme, which has kept a lot of Western economies, and especially the US, operating for quite a while. So if you have an interest rate that's sufficiently low, like in the case of Japan or the case of, post 2008, pre-COVID, you can actually sustain very high levels of debt without it becoming a problem. The problem actually comes when either growth stops, when the population starts to decline, or when interest rates rise. And all three of those things are now a problem.
Oh, yeah, it is concerning. Yeah.
And so that's the thing that Western economies are going to start to have to grapple with. That previously, up until now, those three things have all been very positive. You've had good, solid growth rates, interest rates have been incredibly low, and you've had populations that are growing. And now you're not going to have those things. So is debt going to continue to be sustainable? And I wonder if you don't mind if just taking through a couple of the examples of when debt wasn't sustainable for a couple of different countries.
Please
and
do.
Then just see. Yeah.
I know which countries are going to come up, Charlie.
Do you want to take just a stab in the dark as to which country's going to come up?
Just like any Latin American country. Is that?
If you just start in the alphabet, Argentina.
Would it be Argentina by any chance, Charlie?
Yeah, it would be. Actually, it would be, Jack. They've got a hat trick of debt defaults in the last 20 years. So in the last, 25 years. Starting off in 2001, post-millennium. So what Argentina made the very bad mistake in doing was essentially pegging its own currency, the peso, to the US dollar 1-for-1. And it also priced all of its debt in terms of US dollars. So what happened was that the peso was incredibly overvalued. Exports were incredibly expensive as a result. Then naturally what happened was that because the Argentinian economy essentially started to fail, debt became more and more of a problem as interest rates began to rise and people became more and more concerned that Argentina wouldn't be able to pay their debt. And naturally, a consequence of that was that Argentina defaulted on its debt for the first time in 2001, which necessitated a payout, which was a default of about 100 billion, which remains the largest sovereign default in history. So that was 2001.
Yeah, well done, Argentina.
Yeah. So we'll just do a little round of applause.
But you can do better.
Yeah. They learned from that mistake. So in 2018, they had to request an IMF bailout for 57 billion. And that is the largest IMF bailout in history. So another round of applause, Argentina. And then in 2020, Argentina actually defaulted on its debt again on $56 billion of debt. And the problem with this is that, it's like that mate that doesn't keep paying you back. The third time, you sort of start to question whether you want to give this person money for that extra pint. And what happens is that, not pointing any fingers at one of your housemates, Jack. He doesn't listen, it's fine. So essentially what happens is that people start to demand higher interest rates on this debt. And so what happens is that Argentina now can basically not borrow any money for any real cost. For any real value. So essentially they are limited by the amount of public investment they're able to do. And that's fundamentally one of the other problems, which is that, public debt is really important as a means to be able to grow the economy and get yourself out of bad situations, like in a recession. Or Argentina doesn't have that means. And they've recently got in this libertarian leader who doesn't believe in government spending at all. And so that might be in some ways a relatively positive thing to be able to limit their ability to spend, which might start to slowly rebuild confidence.
Yeah, I mean, he is extremely libertarian. I mean, he really did cut everything. He's the one that went round with a chainsaw saying, I'm going to, axe everything, and obviously not an axe, chainsaw. Yeah.
I didn't even have to point that one out.
Funny, yeah. But you can see that it's caused some really short-term big problems for them. But the Argentinians he still had high popularity ratings because the Argentinians are almost like, look, we've had such bad issues so frequently that we need a change and we need some sort of extreme measures. I don't know if these measures should be extreme. I probably wouldn't say so, but you can see that why Argentina felt like they needed to change, because 3 times a hat trick. I mean, for a while I was wondering, how can governments actually default on debt? Like, isn't their credit rating just always AAA? Just because how can you default as a country? Well, Argentina really showed us, no guys, just little hypothetical experiment. Can we default 3 times in a row? Yes, we can. Very proud of you guys.
You have to give it to them. It is impressive. So the other big one around a similar time, 20 years earlier, was the Latin American debt crisis of the 70s and 80s. And fundamentally here, what happened was that the countries in Latin America, so namely Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and a few others, borrowed quite heavily from international commercial banks, these called petrodollars. These commercial banks had a lot of money from selling oil. And these loans were essentially used to fund infrastructure projects, possible corruption going on a little bit there, under the assumption that growth would continue. Remember, I said before that debt is sustainable as long as your economy continues to grow, because debt to GDP essentially falls. But obviously in the early 80s, America was grappling with the stagflation crisis because of the oil spike. So the same thing that was giving these commercial banks such high profits was also causing inflation in the US. And then the renowned Volcker shock, the central bank governor Paul Volcker, or chairman, sorry, I should say, Paul Volcker, raised interest rates massively in the 80s. That then pushed up interest rates above growth rates, and then you saw that these debts were no longer sustainable and they continued to spiral out of control until the point where sequentially each of these countries defaulted on their debt, and then subsequently had very similar problems to Argentina, where they just were not afforded debt at low interest rates, and then they were limited with the amount of public investment they could do because they'd been very bad before. And obviously you saw this in Greece with the Eurozone crisis, a very similar story playing out there, that you can maintain these debts if you have very low interest rates and growth and et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of raises questions for what we do, because we're very structurally different to these countries. You know, we have our own central bank, we can print our own money as the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan have this sort of unique ability in some sense to be able to control our own money supply. But why can't we just continue to print money indefinitely and do this?
Well, I thought that people just learnt this is like the first thing I learnt in history, which is just every time a government's tried to print money to pay for its debt, that has always caused hyperinflation. It's like, it's really, really easy. Like it's, yeah. I mean, Milton Friedman basically got a Nobel Prize just from pointing out this fact that everyone knew. Like, yeah, print loads of money and it becomes worthless. So, yeah, it's pretty crazy. Just to be clear, you know, we do sort of print money through quantitative easing and stuff, but that is a different thing. If you print money just to pay off your debt, that is 100% inflationary. Like that is.
Yeah. Quantitative easing has other side, and also it's not nearly to the same scale that just printing money at mass to pay debt is. I mean, obviously you saw this in Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, in Hungary in the 40s or something, I think, where just hyperinflation prices were rising at, you know, they were doubling every 15 hours in Hungary, I believe, which is just absolutely insane. Absolutely insane.
If there is some sort of limit, or at least a point where debt does become unsustainable, then you can start understanding that although we'll never pay off our debt to 0%, like it doesn't go like that, you've got to be aware that because there's a limit, you are forcing future generations to basically either reduce their spending, well, basically reduce their spending. That is all they can do, really, isn't it? Or allow for some sort of crazy inflation by printing money. But the point there is that it matters why you're getting into so much debt. So is it for investing in infrastructure or something that boosts productivity? That might be a positive thing. That should be treated differently, I think, because that's going to increase our growth rate, and it's a positive rate of return. Like any business, that's a good thing. Take on debt, invest for something that higher rate of return than the cost of your capital. That makes sense. The problem, I think, with debt comes really when you're getting into high levels of debt for just spending on transfer payments. Like either, look, I'm thinking about one person in particular, but do you know who it is?
Good old Liz.
Exactly, yeah. So if you do it just by cutting taxes or something, just spending more than you earn, but not through investment of any kind, that is quite bad, because you're passing that payment on to future generations.
So I'm not lost for words on this topic, I'm not going to lie, Jack. I've got some things to say about like good old Liz. Okay, so I just want to point out the pure hypocrisy that went on around this government budget with regards to debt. Okay, and this is sort of what I was saying with the increased inclination for the right wing to start spending money. Fundamentally, you've got to start at the premise that the right wing prefers private level investment to public investment.
Yeah.
And that is a valid standpoint, right? The idea of government debt is that it crowds out private investment fundamentally. And there's debate among economists to an extent, but the idea is that if the government spends a lot of money, then that money has to come from somewhere. And fundamentally, that money is paid for by private individuals. So what happens is that those private individuals then have less money to spend on other private capital. And so what happens is that as the government's spending more, although you're still buying capital and investing, like Jack was saying, then you're not investing in other things. And this pushes up interest rates, as we saw with Liz Truss, with the mortgage payments, etc. But fundamentally, her whole standpoint was to try and increase private investment through the tax cuts. So on the one hand, she was trying to increase private investments on the tax cuts, which there's no evidence for working, by the way. But even if that was true in principle, she was then completely cancelling out that effect by running huge government deficits, which were then crowding out that same private investment. So it was a completely hypocritic, was that a word? That's not a
Hypocritical.
word. Hypocritical argument, right? And so it's really frustrating. And that's obviously the main argument against government debt is that private sector investment is more effective than public sector investment. So you don't want to be crowding that out. And so Liz Truss was completely...
Hypocritical, John.
No, go yeah. If you're transferring money to either pensions or to, which is increasingly what our debt is being used to fund, or tax cuts, these things are not stimulatory to investment. And so you're not increasing the growth rate. And like I went back to earlier, no, a deficit is sustainable if the growth rate is higher than the interest rate. And if you're not borrowing to increase the growth rate, then you are just making the debt more unsustainable, which is what we're doing with pensions as well.
Yeah.
And it comes back to that.
Exactly. And you're passing it on to future generations who are going to have to either increase tax or reduce their own spending. And like I said, you do need some sort of headroom for when these crises happen. So if there is another pandemic, if there is another financial crash, you're taking away their ability to spend massive amounts of money like we did. I mean, it boosted our debt to GDP. I'm talking about 2008 crisis here.
Yeah.
It boosted it by, was it 20% or 40% of GDP? It was a huge amount.
Oh, I don't know. It's a huge number.
Yeah, and then obviously COVID
and obviously
smashed another load on as well. So,
but then we, like you said, we did it in completely reverse with 2008, and then the subsequent election in 2010, where we imposed this austerity, even in the advantageous position we have of having our own currency and a strong currency, and we started to impose austerity. And austerity is this downward spiral whereby the government spends less money, so we're generating less income, so we have to spend less money, so we generate... An economy is circular. So if you start spending less when private investment is also falling, then naturally the only way for output to go is down. And so you can never cut spending enough to be able to make up for the shortfall. And so what economists are very, there's a consensus now that we should have actually used our ability to print money to spend on public investment. And I'm not saying the old Keynes argument where, you just dig holes in the ground and you don't produce anything productive, because that's not a good idea either. But you've got to spend this money. That would have been a perfect opportunity to spend on public investment and in infrastructure. And we wouldn't have had the sustained economic problems we've had since. And I think the reason America is doing so well, in part, is because of that massive infrastructure bill that Obama put forward in 2009.
Yeah. And this is very much the point I want people to take away from me, at least, is this idea, I said at the beginning, I'll say it again, that we care too much about debt in bad times, so when we have the crisis, and too little when we're in good times. When you're in a bad situation like we were, interest rates are low because no one wants to invest. And that is the prime time to invest in infrastructure things, because our rate of return to that is so much higher than the cost of the debt. So you should definitely do that, pump money in the economy. When it comes to the good times of the economy, when we're in a boom, when we're sustainably growing at our full level of output, as you like, then that's when we should really start then curtailing our spending or reducing our national debt so that we can pay for the times when we are in recession and start spending again. So you can see how we need to get out of this habit of when things are good thinking, oh, right, now's time to spend some more. It's like, no, this is now, we've spent before, we need to pay that back now, basically. And
exactly. So you can do that through not necessarily cutting absolute spending or tax, but you can allow for the growth rate to make up for that difference. But you then can't inflate your spending in line with it. I would like to say on one thing, I think this is a really important point that people miss. A deficit in the government's spend, if the government spends too much, that allows for individuals to save. So we talk about the national debt like, oh, the country owes this much. No, the government owes this much. But remember, it's a circular economy. If someone is saving, the other person has to be borrowing. If the other one person is borrowing, they have to be borrowing from someone. And the idea is that the government overspending allows for positive savings in the private sector. So if you look at this on a graph, it is 1 for 1. You look at how much the government is spending. It is exactly the inverse of what the public have in savings. And so the government in borrowing does also produce a market for us to be able to save, which is important for private individuals' stability. Obviously, you don't want to do this to the extreme. You don't want any sort of imbalances in the economy. But I think it is an important factor that deficits are not inherently bad. They're just one half of the balance sheet in one sense. And so I do think this is an important thing to point out. Obviously, you can have situations where the foreign sector makes up for it, but those are very rare, and in the data it just doesn't happen very often.
So I'm going to slightly disagree there. I think it's a valid point that you've made there, but isn't this the problem of crowding out? That if our savings are going into paying for government debt, and if that government debt's not being spent on investment, but actually is just paying for transfer payments and blah, 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 then this money isn't going into private investment, which is the things that is going to boost our growth.
No, you're right. But again, it's an if, but it could be used in many ways. All I'm saying is that taking some of the heat away from the argument of debt, it's not, you can't think about it in the same way as that. You're right that, there's definitely an argument to be made of, is that money more useful in the hands of the government or in terms of private individuals? I would make the argument that, private individuals in the UK haven't shown themselves to be particularly inclined to invest. So in some ways you might need the public to make up for that shortfall. But I'm just saying that it's not, you can't think about it symmetrically to household debt because it's not the same. And that's sort of my point.
I get you.
And one problem that can arise is the Ray Dalio argument. I don't really, how do I say this? I don't really appreciate Ray Dalio's arguments very much.
You make it sound like he's been an assault on you, like he's attacking you with his arguments. And you're like, just please leave me alone.
I have had to read his book, and I thought it was one of the most insufferable 2 weeks of my life. Ray Dalio, for those of you who don't know, is the hedge fund manager of Bridgewater Investments, which is the biggest hedge fund in the world, and they operate a trading strategy. So they trade assets based on macroeconomic factors. And the main macroeconomic factor that they are interested in is what Ray Dalio, the genius, calls debt cycles. And please don't read his book. It's just too long. It's awful and it doesn't make much sense. But basically the idea is that there are these long-run debt cycles whereby empires and nations of interest, so namely China in history, the British Empire, the US currently, they run these debt cycles whereby they essentially get to the top of the world by accumulating debt, accumulating trade deficits, and using those resources to essentially boost themselves to the top. But his argument is that, I guess in line with what we were saying, that eventually those debts become unsustainable and naturally you then get crises via debt collapse. And he uses some very hand-picked examples to make this point, I'll say that. But his argument essentially is that debt is fundamentally unsustainable if it's at a national level. And what happens is that in times of crisis, you get these what are called mass deleveraging events, whereby a single shock in confidence can have this sort of chain reaction throughout the financial system, like happened in 2008, whereby people start to deleverage themselves. They start to essentially get rid of their debt. And this causes a massive drop in asset prices, a collapse in confidence, and that creates massive negative wealth shocks throughout the economy, which then are very hard to deal with. And that's essentially, and then at that point, I guess the argument is the nation doesn't have the capacity to be able to do these stimulus packages because they've spent too much already, and they have to do austerity because they don't have any other means to fight the recession. And so I guess in that sense, and in the extreme case, that is right, and that has happened in a few cases in history. It's not necessarily the primary factor that Ray Dalio makes it out to be, but it is one of the possible reasons, and that can lead to these unsustainable economies and the fall of empires, if you want to sell books.
Right, but I mean that contradicts the whole theory of how when you have recessions that yes, all the private sector and companies are deleveraging, but the whole point, the almost antidote to that, is the government taking on more debt themselves, because that sort of counteracts the deleveraging, and you're encouraging both confidence and spending and higher expectations, which actually in recessions crowds in investment. By investing yourself, because no one else is, and you'll essentially have more productive projects than they do. But yeah, okay, I just disagree with this argument.
No, you're making nothing but excellent points from you, Jack. Nothing.
So is he talking about very extreme points when debt to GDP is like extremely high, or is he just like what are the points in history where this is correct?
I have no idea what he's on about at times, Jack. I think he misunderstands the relation. I think personally he misunderstands the relationship between private debt and public debt. If I'm completely honest, because exactly, that would be my exact counter argument. Worth mentioning because people seem to respect his opinion. And he does run an incredibly big hedge fund which has made money off of this theory. So maybe we're in the wrong. I don't know. But
that's true. But a lot of ideas are just correlated with the correct outcomes, right? That doesn't mean they're correct. They're just correlated.
That's a good quote.
Yeah. Because there is a business cycle, and I'm sure that links up to the credit cycle that he's talking about. So yeah, I guess you would make money from that. Just you don't need to be right.
Yeah. Yeah, and my argument is that it wasn't. He makes out. I think he uses the British Empire. I think I've read this a long time ago. But I think and he was sort of making the argument. World War One was essentially a debt crisis that crippled us. But Keynes famously wrote the How to Pay for a War book, and the whole idea of how to pay for a war was through the accumulation of a national effort of everyone saving. So there were these war tokens, war coupons, I think they were called, where the government, if you were patriotic, if you saved, you need to save for the war effort. So essentially it was funded by its own populace. And so in that case, deleveraging wouldn't be a risk because you've got a surplus of savings in the in the private sector. So it made no sense. So it wasn't the debt that caused the collapse of the British Empire. It was more complex socio-political and economic reasons rather than just debt. It's an oversimplification of a complex issue. So
I see.
Yeah.
Right. Nice one. Shall we end it there then, Charlie?
Shall we? I think that was I think we pretty much said everything we need to do. Another what is it now? Fortnightly dose of wisdom.
Yeah, I'm sort of hoping that we're almost not as right about this as we were the tariffs thing.
It's getting exhausting being right all the time, Jack. It'd be nice to have a little bit of a mental challenge at some point.
Very good. Right, I'll see you next time, Charlie. I think to talk about those spicy recent topics that have been coming up. So yeah.
Ooh, stay tuned,
guys. Bye.
Okay.